I want to thank all of you for really enlightening talks. I realized, however, one always realizes the mistake one makes in organizing a conference afterwards, that I put you in the wrong order, and that we actually should have begun with the historian, gone on to the philosopher, and then ended with the politician and author. Because you all, the overlap is very interesting. We've already had many people comment on, the continuities between Philo and anti-Semites. But you both went further in bringing this up. I'm hopeful, guardedly hopeful, that in reporting on this conference, at least some people will be able to notice the nuances that have come out here. Guardedly hopeful. But let me start, therefore, with a question for the historian. I really liked the way that you talked about the birth of at least modern anti-Semitism as a response to anxieties of the modern by both Jews and non-Jews. I thought that was extraordinarily helpful. And I also thought, of course, your pan-European description of that was important. In the light of the questions that are most in the forefront of this conference, though, it's striking that only Germany, among all of the collaborators and perpetrators going back, that only Germany has taken the burden of responsibility on its shoulders. I wonder if you could say a little bit about why that's the case, and whether, this is such a tricky thing to say, because of course, if I slip one word wrong, somebody's going to accuse me of sounding like Ernst Nolte. But I loathe Nolte and his theses, and that ought to be clear to anybody who's read anything that I've written. And nevertheless, that is one of the questions that your lecture left me, Omer. Why are none of the other nations in a position to acknowledge their responsibility? There's a wonderful book by Jelena Subotchek, who we're going to hear from tomorrow, about the ways in which that fed into anti-communism. But I wonder if you could just riff on that for a little bit.
Sure, without going to another long lecture.
No,
So years ago, George Mosse famously said that if we were to anticipate where there would be a Holocaust before the Holocaust, we would have probably said France. Because that was, the Dreyfus affair, the Action Française. Actually, Nolte wrote about all of that in The Three Faces of Fascism, Faschismus in seiner Epoche. So in a sense, first of all, we have to acknowledge that Nazism was not ex nihilo, that there was a much larger context for it. But what I would say is that Germany, first of all, deserves the place that it has in the history of the Holocaust, because Germany was the country in which a regime came to power that was determined to solve the Jewish question. And that was the only regime, that was the only country in which such a regime came to power. And Germany happened to have been a very powerful country and happened to have had an expansionist policy that took it from its own borders, where there were only just over 500,000 Jews, to areas where there were a very large concentration of Jews. So, in Germany, there's often, among German scholars, there's a worry that if you begin to talk about the complicity of others, then you're taking Germany off the hook. And there's always that danger. At the same time, of course, as I said, the fact of the matter is that it would have been very difficult for Germany to carry out the final solution so effectively without widespread collaboration by various sectors of different societies on all echelons of these societies, whether in Western Europe or in Eastern Europe. And for those societies, there are various reasons why it took very long to come to terms with that and to begin to confront that history. The first reason is, of course, that Germany took it upon itself, and Germany was the initiator. And so Austria could say that it was Germany's first victim, and not that large numbers of Austrians were among the Nazis who were actually carrying out the genocide. In France, it took a very long time because of a very specific context in France, which had to do with the history of the resistance. And therefore, it took until 1995 for Jacques Chirac to be able to come up, and never Mitterrand, the socialist, who in the 1930s was associated with the Action Française, only in 1995 for Jacques Chirac to come and actually accept responsibility for the actions of Vichy. The cover for that was that we were all in the resistance, and that both the Jews and the French were victims, but heroic fighters against the occupation. And because the numbers were similar, about 75,000 resistants and 75,000 Jews who were deported, of which most of the Jews didn't come back and half of the resistants did, then that became possible within the notion that de Gaulle had brought of we were all part of the resistance, right? In Eastern Europe, there was a very different story, and you alluded to it. Eastern Europe was under communist rule. And under the communists, there was a completely different narrative, and that narrative was not specific about the Holocaust at all. That narrative was the anti-fascist narrative, and the Soviets actually dismantled a large number of Holocaust memorials that had been put up by surviving Jews right after the war in various places in Eastern Europe, including in the town that I wrote on in Buchach. They dismantled them because that did not fit into the communist story. And so that started coming up only after the end of communist rule in Eastern Europe, but what then came up was not only the story of the Holocaust, but also the story of the freedom fighters who fought both against the Nazis and against reoccupation, as they saw it, by the Red Army. And the problem was that those who fought against reoccupation by the Red Army happened to have often been those who collaborated with the Nazis in the killing of the Jews, which is why I say that to have fought against the Nazis does not mean that you were not pleased by the killing of the Jews. You could do both at the same time. So this is why all of this began in Eastern Europe, where most of the Jews had lived and most were murdered, only in the 1990s and later, and why that discourse is so complicated, because to give the gist of it, it's the story of what is called the double genocide. There was the genocide of the Jews by the Germans and a few rotten apples among our own people, and then there was the genocide by the communists of our own people, and the communists, well, many of them were Jews. And so we're quits. That's the problematics of this story, which is still ongoing right now in Eastern Europe, including a complication that we probably won't talk about of what is happening right now in Ukraine.
We'll talk about those questions tomorrow at some length. You know, what interests me, and this comes, of course, to Omri's discussion of the singularity thesis. The singularity thesis was not a claim of, you know, sort of an ontological claim. It was a political intervention at a moment when Ernst Nolte and people around him were refusing to take the kinds of responsibility that German citizens should very well have taken, which I take it with all its problems, and I share your criticism of Habermas, particularly later on. At that moment, it was a question of taking responsibility, and it was the right thing to do. Omri, I'm not sure that I want to talk more about that question. What I'm much more interested is in your talking about Zionism and post-colonialism being two sides of the same coin, and I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Sure. First, let me, I mean, there's a methodological issue that bothered me. You said we should have had the historian, the philosopher, and the
you want the queen of the sciences first?
And I was like, wait a second, philosophy is either the foundation or the culmination, but not somewhere in the middle. Look.
I've lost my view of philosophy as the queen of the sciences, so.
I have it. Yeah. Look, Zionism and post-colonial theory, critical race, they do share, I think, a lot in common. And that is a certain suspicious, for very good reasons, suspicious relation to the Enlightenment. In many ways, Zionism is the mother of identity politics, because the argument is just that. Enlightenment, liberal neutrality did not protect us. It did not save our lives. It did not protect our rights. And for that reason, we need to overcome the commitment to those principles and have our own identity politics. And if you criticize that from a universalist perspective, you're racist, anti-Semitic, right? That is a lingo. And I must say, if there was ever an identity politics that's justified in many ways, that's Zionism. I think it makes a lot of sense, and that needs to be stated. Doesn't make it justified. I don't think in the final analysis we should endorse it. Maybe it was to be endorsed in a particular moment in history. By the way, I'm not sure that it should have been. Maybe it should have been. I think that's a complicated question. Say, when you complicated it with the question of the Nakba and issues like that. I'm not entering that at that moment. We can talk about that. But it had very good reasons to be endorsed, no lesser than most trends that we're seeing today, I think. Of course, say when you look at the Palestinians looking at the Zionist project and interpreting it as a colonialist project, they are in their rights as well. Right? So if that is your position on the Enlightenment, if that's your position on universalism as inherently violent with its universalism, then there are excellent reasons to think that, if Zionism is a form of universalism, so many people around us today argue. Saul Friedlander was arguing that in Die Zeit against Dirk Moses at the time. I thought that was disastrous. That needs to be said, right? If you think that somehow Zionism is a form of universalism, then you actually agree with the post-colonialist criticism of Enlightenment universalism. And I think that a lot of Holocaust studies has in a way functioned, though not always fully aware of that, functioned as a form of such anti-Enlightenment, precisely because it was, in many ways, very conducive to delegitimizing the insistence on universalism and on the authority, not just on universalism as an idea, but rather on the authority of universalism. So it doesn't matter if you like it or not. It doesn't matter so much. Danny was here yesterday. It doesn't matter so much how you feel in your stomach about Jews not wishing or to be a minority anymore. It's not about what you feel in your stomach. It's about the authority of reason, universalism. That used to be the statement. The point is this, and this is again a good Kantian point. So we have here an antinomy, right? That's probably the most Kantian issue here when we think of universalism. There's a real antinomy that is a contradiction that's not really a contradiction between two positions. The identity politics of the Jews, which has excellent reasons, the identity politics of the Palestinians in that case, which has excellent reasons. And the question is whether, if that's the contradiction, then it's going to be resolved only by power. And I would like to argue against that. The only way to overcome it is to insist on the authority of universalism, both in answering Israel and in answering some forms of Palestinian critiques. And here I want to say something to Omer, something that you mentioned at the end of the talk, which of course was relevant to the things that I was thinking of. But I think we need to be very specific. You said we need to state truth to power, and we need to state this against the government of Israel and against some forms of political correctness, identity politics, and so forth. But I think that when it comes to the Israeli government, we need to be more specific, because it cannot then be policies of the Israeli government, because that's not what this is about, and that has been often the place to escape to comfortably. It's not to go and ask a question of the Israeli government, but rather of the idea of a Jewish state, which, again, in Germany, is often the moment when you allegedly cross the line and become anti-Semitic.
Can I just jump in one sentence?
If it's very short, yeah. I'm going to give you all a chance to respond to each other, but...
It's not in response to this. We can talk about that later. It's more the origins of Zionism. I think, as the historian, I just want to say that Zionism begins long before the Holocaust, and Zionism is a product of ethno-nationalism that develops in Central and especially in Eastern Europe. It takes all its models from there. It's territorial ethno-nationalism, with the only difference being that the territory that he talks about is not the territory where the Jews live, but the territory that the Jews want to go to Eretz Israel, right? So in that sense, it's as non-universal as all the other, there's nothing special about it. It's very similar to Polish nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, and so forth. That changes, of course, later on when we look at it today. And the second thing I think we have to remember is the socialist element of Zionism, which has not come up here, which is universalist, has a universalist assertion. The fact that it's no longer viable today is, of course, correct, but I don't think we understand what Zionism is, the kind of Zionism that establishes the Jewish state, without remembering that it claims to itself and to others that it is actually also part of a universal socialist revolution.
Sure. Let me just say a couple of preparatory words. We do have time for discussion so that people who want to ask questions can start lining up to do so. I want to make an exception. We said at the beginning of this conference that we weren't going to waste time with long bios and giving people's titles and histories. Instead, their bios outside the door on the table. I believe there's a new set of them that have just been put in. I'm going to make an exception in the case of Avraham Burg because for people who don't know who he is, particularly for the Germans in this audience and conceivably the German journalists in this audience who actually have chosen to attend the conference rather than complain about it without attending, of whom there are some. Avraham Burg is the author of a best-selling book called The Holocaust is Over, We Must Rise from Its Ashes. But he was also, for a very long time, a politician in many capacities in the Israeli government, including Speaker of the Knesset. I suppose we can think of you as the Nancy Pelosi of Israel. I mean, no, sorry. Just teasing. Given your magnificently clear description of the way in which the Holocaust has put money in the bank of the state of Israel, I hope everybody gets the idea that this was an analogy and not useful for anti-Semitic propaganda. I wonder if you could talk a little more explicitly about the mechanisms by which this has happened, the ways in which, of course, as you described, it was not at all a part of the original Israeli ideology and the principles on which the state was founded. At what point in Israeli history did this become an explicit defense of Israeli policy in a way that it had not been. And Avraham is just in a particular position to be able to explain that because he was there.
How long is the seminar today?
I know.
First, thank you very much for your introduction. I think it was Henry Kissinger who was once introduced in such an over-flattering manner, and he said, only my parents were here. My father would have loved it, my mother would even believe you. So having said that, since, as you said, I was many years in Israeli politics, it's quite intuitive for me to circumvent questions, okay? So let me first circumvent and then try to answer, okay? Just about two terms mentioned here. I don't really understand what is a Jewish state. I was running the other day in Jerusalem, and there was a taxi with a bumper sticker, this taxi observes Shabbat. So I said to myself, how does it do it? This taxi lights the candles Friday night, goes to the holy bath, to the mikveh, circumcised. I mean, what's going on with this taxi? It's a very interesting taxi. And actually, the taxi cannot be Shomer Shabbat. Maybe the driver, maybe the proprietor of the taxi does not drive it during Shabbat. A state like a taxi is an instrument in the hands of the people, and by itself, the essence of it has nothing to do with being Jewish or not. The people who operate it might be Jews. So if you call it the state of the Jews, or the state in which there are many Jews, or maybe Jews want to have it this way or that way, I can understand. When you call it a Jewish state, I'm waiting for the circumcision, okay? I'm at least of the West Bank of it, okay? So that's the first term. The second is, I see how cautious you are about, don't say I'm anti-Semite, I'm a Zionist, I'm non-Zionist. I don't have your concerns. Okay, say whatever you like. I mean, it's fine with me. I mean, I've been to the Israeli Knesset so many years, you cannot imagine what was said and will be said. Another one. So I want to take the term Zionist, okay? I have no clue who is a Zionist. Who is a Zionist? The one born to a Zionist mother? Like the law written, who is a Jew? I have no clue. I don't even think there is one definition which defines all the Zionists who define themselves as Zionists. Having said that, I can say, what is it for me? Zionism was an essential movement to restructure the Jewish people from an exilic structure to a sovereign one. It was the scaffolding, as Ben-Gurion described it at 48, that made the reconstruction possible. In 48, the mission was accomplished in an amazing achievement for the Jewish people and an awful tragedy for the Palestinians. But from this moment on, we don't need the scaffolding anymore. Zionism expired in May 48. And whatever we do ever since within Israel, forget about around the world, we use the Zionism as a tool for something else. I have three names. My family name is I'm a human being. My middle name is I'm an Israeli. My private name is I'm Avraham, I'm Jewish, I'm an environmentalist, I'm a feminist. All of the identities you would like to attribute to me. I do not need the fourth definition of being a Zionist in order to define my Israeliness. What is not covered by the three terms that Zionism covers? Unless I need it as a tool to discriminate somebody or to define somebody. The ultra-Orthodox, the Arabs, the asylum seekers, or whatever it is. And therefore, when we talk today about Zionism, for me, it's a tool of discrimination within the Israeli society, which I'm not collaborating with. Having said that, how did it happen? Each and every one of us can give any answer you want. Okay, which is a philosophical, historical, political, personal, because of our stories. I will say it's a very interesting political controversy within Israel. about two trials. Kastner trial at the 50s. Kastner was the leader of, one of the leaders, or the leader of Hungarian Jewry that organized an escape train with 1,200 people, or what? Saved. The rest of Hungarian Jewry, or many of them, were killed in a very short, quick period of time. Somebody accused him of being a collaborator. So he decided to sue. But the trial became an upside down. All of a sudden, the defendant became the accuser, Malkiel Greenwald. And he accused the entire Zionist system of you Zionists of the land of Israel actually wanted the Holocaust to happen in order for the Zionist concept to be validated. It was an awful, terrible split within the Israeli society. It was the 50s. The labor leadership of the time had to find an answer. How do you answer such an accusation? 10 years later, or no, less than 10 years later, less than a decade later, thank God we discovered Eichmann. So we had another trial. Through this trial, we actually, the establishment of the time, the Ben-Gurions of the time, politically speaking, forget about Eichmann crimes, etc., which he should be indicted one way or another. But it was used for political reasons to say, no, we're not as bad as you said because it's Eichmann responsible. It's not Ben-Gurion responsible for the Holocaust. So with these two major trials that split the Israeli society during Kastner and unified it around the Holocaust at the Eichmann trial, one thing happened. The silence was compromised. The first generation was actually traumatized and shocked and actually didn't talk in public. It became a public issue. When it became a public issue and we became part of the public discourse, Begin was a better Holocaustic orator than those who opposed him. And eventually the first Begin coalition, which comprised the excluded, the deprived, and the Holocaustic Jews, made the Holocaust their strategy.
Omri wants to say a word, but can I just push a little bit? When does it become an official part of Hasbara to deflect any criticism of the state as anti-Semitic? Because we have heard, I heard yesterday from a reporter in a German paper that the embassy, for example, invites itself standardly to newspaper meetings to explain. Hasbara supposedly means explain. It's Israelis, for Israelis it means something like propaganda. There are people from the embassy sent to newspaper reporters. I met some Norwegians recently, oddly enough, who said the embassy had come to them. They were Norwegian theologians who had a particular agenda, and they were being pushed to accept the IRA definition and instead of any options. So there is a concerted effort. This is not a conspiracy theory. There is a concerted effort, and I wonder if you could tell us when that began.
I don't really know, but I will say as follows. It's earlier than the Likud and the conservatives. When Abba Eban said at the UN right after 67 that the 67 lines are Auschwitz borders, that's the same family of arguments. The notions were there. At the past, we use it rarely because it was a rare commodity. Later, it became the marketplace itself. Okay, they used it every now and then when needed in order to push Germany there, to push the Americans there, be careful, etc. With the years, and ask yourself a different pedagogical question. When did it start in Israel and all over the world to go to these roots journeys? The minute people are looking for deep roots, at least with us, it's not Kunta Kinte. At least with us, it is, for many, it's the Holocaust or the ruins of the Muslim world Jewry as an outcome of the establishment of the State of Israel. So it's deep and ancient and old.
Omri and then Omer, quick responses to that, and then we'll go to the audience.
Avram, I cannot solve the mystery of a Jewish taxi, but I think I do know what a Jewish state is. A Jewish state is a state where sovereignty is in the hands of the Jewish people, and authority is one way or another, not theologically necessarily, but in the hands of the Jewish people. One way to understand that concept is precisely by contrast to this Habermasian notion of constitutional patriotism. That is, it is not a state where the citizens as such are the sovereign, but rather the Jews. We had it, you were there, I was doing this debate with Moshe Halbertal about the question of a Jewish democracy. We had Moshe Halbertal was saying Israel is not it's not about Jewish sovereignty. It's a state of all of its citizens because, and you're here as former Speaker of the House, the sovereign in Israel is a Knesset and everybody votes. You jumped, I jumped, knowing that that's not true. The sovereign in Israel may be in some official ways a Knesset, but Zionists, as the term is now commonly understood, are the ones who seek to ensure that sovereignty remains in the hands of the Jewish people, even if officially the sovereign is the parliament, regardless of religion and race. Right? By the way, we're going to see that, I think we're seeing this now in a very powerful way. The sovereign, the parliament, has now voted against extending the apartheid legislation in the West Bank. I think everybody is waiting now for the military commander in the West Bank to extend this, right? Once parliament is actually ruling in a way that's not consistent with the Jewish people or the wish of what allegedly everybody knows the Jewish people would like, there will be ways to circumvent that and assert the wish of the Jewish people. That's just one example. So I want to challenge you with that so that we actually do know what a Jewish state is, and we must take a very clear position about that.
Two points. One again on the Jewish state. The Jewish state is declared the Jewish state with the Declaration of Independence, read by David Ben-Gurion, and if you read it, that's what it says, and it says very clearly, it connects it to the long history of Jews. It says that Jews have come back to their ancestral land. It connects it to the Holocaust directly. So all of this is already stated right at the beginning, at the birth of the state. What it is, I would say, is the embodiment of what I said before, of ethno-nationalism. And there's nothing very special about that. It is something that many other ethno-national movements have wanted to create, a state in which one ethnos is the majority. And you can find numerous such states. And in the interwar period, in the 1930s, after the collapse of the multi-ethnic empires, a multitude of ethno-states, ethno-national states, was created in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, and those states had the problem that they wanted to be a Polish state, a Ukrainian state, but they actually had large minorities. And so the concept of a minority was born as a result of that. So Israel is part of that trajectory, but as Tony Judd said 20 years ago or more, in the case of Israel, it became, he argued, an anachronism. We can ask whether it is or it isn't, but that's the origin of it. And I think that's very easy to analyze. I don't see much of a problem there. We may not like it, but it's a simple mechanism. The second issue is on when does the Holocaust start to play an important role? So as I said, it is already there at the birth of the state. It's right there at the beginning. If you read that document, it's a really interesting document. But when does it then come into political use? And I think, yes, the Kastner trial is an important moment. The Eichmann trial is an important moment, for sure. But Eichmann was not found. Everybody knew where he was for a long time, so there had to be a decision, actually, to find him. It's not like they didn't know. But I would say that it's in 1973. My own sense is that 1973 is the moment at which the Holocaust starts playing a really important role in not only politics, but in a kind of collective psychology of the state.
Because of the war.
Because of the war and because of the sense, a full state sense, but still a very powerful one. And I remember it, I was a soldier at the time, a sense that the whole thing was about to collapse and that another Holocaust is going to happen. And if you draw the trajectory from 73 to 77, when Begin comes to power, there is a connection there, quite apart from the issue of Mizrahi Jews, who are probably a more crucial aspect in the rise of Begin to power than any of this. So I think it's at that point, and what is really crucial to understand, I think, is that the second generation, that is, I think, Avram's generation, my own, is the generation that was complicit in internalizing the Holocaust as part of their own identity. Not the survivors, but the children of, who make that into part of their own identity, both because of what I just said and because there is a general discourse at that time that, as I said earlier, Peter Novick already wrote about, which is La Concurrence des Victimes, a book that was mentioned yesterday, that is that there's a general Western predilection to identify with victimhood and to want to be a victim, not actually somebody who's victimized, of course, nobody wants that, but to identify with a group of victims.
As interesting as this conversation is to me, I'm going to be as ruthless as I possibly can. Technically, we are scheduled to have a lunch break in something like 10 minutes. I'll extend a little bit over that, but I will ask all the people lining up once again to ask short questions, and all the people here to give short answers. Philip Gorski was first in line.
Quick question. So we've read a lot about the ways in which the memory of the Holocaust and Nazism have been instrumentalized by Putin to justify his intervention in the Ukraine. But I've really come across far less reflection about the way in which memories of Nazism and the Holocaust have shaped the Western response to Putin, and whether or not the situation in Ukraine might actually reshape or rupture these memories in some way.
You know, Philip, we are planning to devote almost an entire day to those questions tomorrow. And so I'm going to try being ruthless and ask you to wait and ask that question then. And I can't see who's next, but whoever is next,
Hello.
Okay.
My name's Alana. Thank you for this panel. My question is coming from the Jewish left and how we can instrumentalize some of these histories in new ways from the Jewish left. And particularly, I'm interested in Omri's comment about the right hijacking the center and bringing them more rightward, and wondering if the left can learn from that tactic in how we memorialize the Holocaust, and also Avraham Burg's call to action at the end of your lecture about how can we articulate, well, my question is, how can we articulate our story to our own people towards this world coalition against hatred?
Yeah, look, I don't want to hijack anything. I think that we need to try to insist on, I don't want to hijack and I don't want to instrumentalize. I think that it is true that all human activities are prone to instrumentalizing and hijacking. But I think that the commitment to not doing that, especially with occurrences like, the memory of the Holocaust and so forth, I think it's actually essential that we would protect ourselves from seeking to do this in a more effective way. I think that the fall down, this is a strong term for a person that I respect, but the fall down of Habermas's position is that you cannot support a universalist perspective by the authority of something that's not universal. You cannot support the authority of reason by appealing to something outside of reason. The only argument for universalist Germany should have been universalism, not the history of the Germans. Once the reason for accepting universalism in Germany was Germans' history, that's already the seeds of the collapse of the position. And I think that that is something that we need to remind ourselves today. We better not try to instrumentalize or hijack memory in order to do what we want to do. I don't know you, but what I want to do. I think there is no other way than insisting on the authority of reason, and that means not on the power of memory, not on the power of religion, but on the power of reason.
Avraham, do you want to respond to the question to you?
No. I contemplate because it's in a way it's not what we're talking here. It's about identity and belonging and all. So I'd like just to lay a couple of bricks for a future wall. I wonder why so many political systems in our world are driving back to the past, make America great again, the Neo-Ottoman Empire, the 10th century Tsarism, building the Third Temple. Everybody drives back somewhere. And one of the reasons is because the future doesn't look very promising. I mean, the global warming, the nuclear capabilities in the sub-states' hands, and the pensions are not as good as my generation. So the future is not that good. Let's go back to some glorious imagined point and feel good about the past. And I say, at least for me as a Jew, let's not drive back. Because I do not realize any better moment in my history than today. All the past ones are very troubling ones and confusing one and contradicting one. But in order to stay in the place we are today, I want to offer a couple of divorces. Let's divorce from the victim's mentality. We're not victims anymore. Yes, every now and then, this and that, but 98% of the Jews are living in the democratic hemisphere. There are 23,000 Jews in Iran, 3,000 Jews in Morocco, were 2 Jews in Afghanistan who never talked to each other, so one of them passed away, and that's it. Now, the meaning of living in a democratic hemisphere has both responsibilities and meanings, and I give one and I leave it here. Imagine one day something will happen, and I believe, by the way, that it's possible and much closer than meets the eye, that there will be a real comprehensive acceptance, forget about biblical peace, between Israel and the Middle East. Never mind how will it happen, end of occupation, yada, 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 yada. But it's there, it's around the corner. And then Israel, like the rest of the democratic hemisphere Jewry, will live in peace with its environment. The most important question of that time will be a very simple one. Can the Jewish people survive without an external enemy? Give me a war, give me a Holocaust, give me a pogrom, I know what to do. Give me peace. Give me tranquility, give me equality, give me emancipation, give me acceptance, and I'm lost. So in order to arrive to this kind of destiny is to develop a new Jewish language which addresses an identity which is not defined by the external enemy, but by the internal positive values. For this, I need another seminar.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to ask for 2 questions at once, please. I can't quite see you.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
2 brief questions at once.
Okay.
I mean, not 2 from each speaker.
Sorry?
Sorry, not 2 questions from each speaker. 1 question each from 2 speakers, please. It's
Yes.
lunchtime officially now.
Okay, I just put 1 question, and yes, it is about the role of German Angst in the BDS resolution decision, and also with the Habermas thing. I think German Angst has different aspects, also moral one, but most of also very much immoral ones. And so I think what the effect of the BDS resolution is today, that people in the Bundestag have angst to touch the Israel-Palestine subject, which is very harmful, and harmful also for the struggle against racism and anti-Semitism. So my question is, how can, like Omer Bartov said, the spell broken? And I think it's important, and I would like to know what you think about it, to put again the Israel-Palestine good and universalist and perspective, human rights perspective, into this political arena with some steps and very soft ones, and maybe with reference to Zionism, the heritage of cultural Zionism could somehow help. Thank you very much.
And the second question.
Oh.
Louis, you still get a chance. But no, you,
Me?
please. Yes, I can.
Hi. I'm Libby. Nice to meet you. I recognize that it's a little absurd to ask this panel this question, given the identity construction of it, as it would be were I to ask a question about Holocaust memory in women, for example. But we can talk about that with conference organizers later. I want to know, this is mostly for my friend of room, I think, how does the way that you described, the dynamic that you described in the sort of construction of a hegemonic Holocaustic identity, how has that worked in Israel for non-European Jews? And also, how has that played out for non-Jewish citizens in Israel? So are they subject to that? Are they part of it? Is it separate from them? I'd love to hear you comment on that. Thank you.
Any of you want to comment on either?
Should I? I mean, I guess I will take the Habermas direction question. I don't know exactly how the spell can be broken, but I think that in order to begin to think on how it can be broken, we need to notice another thing about Habermas, and this is really not personal about him, but he is a great symbol, in fact, a hero of sorts. But maybe a tragic hero. And it's interesting to learn from the ways in which he had a huge success. And also, in the end, I think we are seeing the limits of that success. When Habermas refuses to speak about Israel, says, that's the moment when you revert back to identity rather than play the public intellectual. At that moment, I think, and I don't know what he would have said, but this is actually a technical philosophical question. Some philosophers have answered me that I need to take into account the significance of speech acts and the significance of context in order to understand the possibility of an answer. Can a German citizen of Habermas's generation actually respond where there is no public possibility of rational discourse? And maybe you have to revert to silence when you're in a certain context that doesn't allow for public rational speaking. I think that's a mistake. Okay, I'll do it fast. I think that's a mistake, and the mistake is a confusion of cause and effect. The task was to create a certain public where rational discussion is possible. It was only possible with a certain leap of faith, that is, good old Kantian courage, of doing this where it was not completely possible. The same thing needs to be done today. Avraham spoke for a moment about the courage that would have to be undertaken in order to take the first bricks from the wall. I think that would have to be done. There will not be a safe space to discuss that issue. We'll have to discuss it without the safe space.
Yeah, very quickly on political discourse in Germany and the role of German Angst. I mean, my sense is that just as Germany was finally able to look at the world differently because of the war in Iraq. It is time for Germany now to start considering its policy vis-a-vis Israel-Palestine as any other policy, and to leave out the politics of angst from it. So that's my own view of this. It is time to let go of this kind of apologetic policies, which is ultimately what enables Israel to continue its suppression of the Palestinians. Regarding the other question, it's a very interesting question. It's the role of the Holocaust in Israel among other communities, not Ashkenazi Jews such as ourselves, I believe. Omri, you are too? I'm not sure.
Half-half.
Half-half, okay. So many are half-half. And so regarding Mizrahim, that is people of Sephardi background, and Palestinians, and I would say that very generally in the most schematic way, one would say that the way Mizrahi communities were integrated into Israeli Ashkenazi-dominated society was by integrating the Holocaust into their own sense of identity. There was a film made 20 years ago in Israel called Don't Touch My Holocaust, Al Tiguli Bashoah, which was exactly about that. Whereas for Palestinians, it's the disintegrating aspect. It's exactly the opposite. The Holocaust always comes up as a cudgel, if to use False's term, against being part of Israeli society. What unifies us, Jews in Israel, is the Holocaust, and what sets them apart is not only not the Holocaust, but the potential that they would do that unto us. So it is a very important question. I think it's much more complicated than the way I put it now, but if you want to think about the simplest way of looking at it, this is how I understand it.
We are closing at 12:30 sharp, but I do need to address something that the next to last speaker said, since it was addressed to the conference organizers. This conference was organized by 3 women. None of us believe in straightforward identity politics. That is 50-50 women, 50-50 this or that. Had we would have had even more complicated discussions than we had about questions of representation. If you only have one person from a particular country, is that tokenism? Then do you need 2 on everything? It's a difficult proposition, but I just want to say that I tend to be in favor of inviting people for their ideas, not their genitals.
Once Henry Kissinger was asked, what is the best number for a panel discussion? He said it should be an odd number, and 3 is too many.
Louis Gordon, quickly, please, and then the gentleman in the white T-shirt, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to close the discussion for this session.
Okay, so I wanted to raise a question that needs a little elaboration that connects Omri to Avraham. And the part of Habermas that was brought up is this point about universalist. But there's the Habermas also of legitimation crisis. And there's a subtext, and I saw it in Avraham's talk, about a legitimation crisis in Israel. And the reason I bring it up is because there's a way that the post-colonial was brought up and the way that reason was brought up that seemed to have reduced reason to formal rationality. And as a consequence, it locks it in contraries when a metacritique of reason can raise a dialectical question that actually goes beyond a locked universal into an ongoing practice of universalizing, which is what I took Avraham is arguing, that interestingly enough links into someone like Fanon, because Fanon argues that, for instance, there's the generation that wants to close the possibility of the future through a closed rationality instead of creating the possibility of legitimation beyond the moment of being held hostage to the kind of narratives that legitimates them through the past. So I was just thinking that there may be a way to understand that there's also a critique of post-colonial reason that actually comes through a critique of the Enlightenment without actually arguing against reason. So I just want to put that on the table.
And what you can, but one more question back there.
Yep. This conversation reminded me of the time some years ago when Bibi Netanyahu said that the Palestinians invented the idea of the Holocaust and gave it to the Germans, which is, of course, a fabrication. But it struck me that that kind of holocaustic, as you describe it, Avraham, shift has perhaps happened in Israeli society, where Israeli Jews see Palestinians not as someone with whom they're in conflict, but someone who's ideologically and fundamentally committed to their erasure. So I'm wondering how much you think this discourse has set root in Israeli Jewish society, and if so, what is to be done about it, and how can we push back against that narrative within Israel, given how sensitive that is?
First, and then we'll finish with Avraham. Unless Omer had something burning to say to either of those questions.
I'll actually answer both questions, but really fast. I think that there's a lot of room also in relation to what Omer was saying and also to your question. I think one thing that ought to be done is to incorporate Palestinians, definitely Palestinian Israelis, into the commemoration of the Holocaust, because the Holocaust commemoration has to be denationalized and become a duty of all citizens. That would be a necessary thing. Just for the record, my position is the same about the Nakba. It's complicated. There's much more to say about this. This is not the moment, but I think that would be necessary. Thanks so much for that question. I think it's a deep and important question, and I think it's a great challenge. I actually did not completely follow the transition to how this connects my position to Avraham's, even though I do not oppose this. I noticed that actually some surprising disagreements between Avraham and me begin to emerge on the question of Zionism and the Jewish state. That surprised me, and it's interesting. It's possible that I will not see the combination. So I want to take up the first part of the question. I do not think that Habermas is a true universalist. And for that reason, I also mentioned this before, I think that there was a real universalist attempt. But I think that the resources are not there, and the reason why he's not a universalist is that he needs to appeal to German identity in order to legitimize the commitment to reason, and that is the result of post-metaphysical thinking. I do not believe that universalism can be post-metaphysical. If it's post-metaphysical, it's not universal. Maybe then there's no universalism. I would then completely give it up. But I think that the attempt to legitimize a universalist politics without a metaphysics ends up necessarily falling back on fake universalism. And for that reason, I think that we tend to agree. So the stakes need to be higher. And then either you can defend the metaphysics, and I would do that. And if you don't, I think I will actually go with you and say, okay, then let's not pretend.
Omer, you said you had a small response?
Yeah, just one thing on the second question, which I thought was interesting. So the Holocaust plays, of course, a role also in the way Palestinians, both in Israel and outside of Israel, but now I'm talking especially in Israel, commemorate the Nakba and generally think about the relationship between Israel, the Jewish state, and themselves as Israeli citizens. And there is an awareness of that by the Israeli state, part of which was a memory law that was passed recently that has an interesting relationship with memory laws passed in Poland and Ukraine as well, which initially wanted to criminalize any commemoration of the Nakba, and eventually, rather than criminalizing it, just said that institutions that do it would have budgetary implications for commemorating the Nakba in Palestinian schools and so forth. What is interesting here is that you can see the potential for something very different. That is, you can see the potential that has not come to the fore, but that is being discussed in some circles in Israel among Jews and Palestinians, of recognizing each other's catastrophic past, which are constitutive parts of their own existence, and of speaking of the Nakba and of the Holocaust as constitutive elements in their current identities. That is, to create a discourse of empathy rather than one of competition. And I think there we can actually, because the Israeli state is not going to be dismantled, that's not going to happen. What we need to think of is some way for these two communities to find a way of living together, of rearranging their politics by way of empathizing with each other's past traumas. And that, to me, is a way forward, rather than simply wishing away what we don't like.
Avraham, last words.
They ask why the deliberations at the Knesset are so long. And the answer is because everything was already said, but not by everyone. So I would like to repeat everything was said, though I did not understand everything that Omri said, okay? Some of the words were a little bit too high for a former politician, okay? Here is a friend of mine. I had to set a meeting with him the other day, and he said, listen, I cannot have a meeting with you because I go to Poland. Let's set a meeting for 2 weeks' time. So we set a meeting for 2 weeks' time. It was Sunday or Monday. Tuesday, he calls me and he said, we can meet tomorrow. I said, but you're in Poland. He said, no, I came back. So I came to meet him, and I said, what happened? He said, listen, I went to Poland, Warsaw, it was January, February. I took a train in the middle of the night to the other side of Poland. So train in Poland, in the forest, with all of this snow and tuck of the rails, etc., all came back to me. I couldn't stand it. I took the first flight back home and flew back home. And I said, Zev, what do you mean all came back to you? Your parents came from Iraq. You were born in Iraq. What do you mean all came back to you? He said, yes, but. Okay, so this is actually something how the Holocaust became a definer of a larger than itself sentiment. It goes to the eternal victimhood. It goes to Jewish history. It goes to so many other things. And then it leads to Libby's and yours second question, and this is about between us and the Palestinians, both within Israel and outside of Israel. I hate it to be another discussion of Zionist liberals how to solve the conflict. It's important to solve the conflict. We need many conferences about it. It's not this one. So I want to limit the answer to the premises of this seminar rather than to whatever happened over there. And Omer here opened the door. At what sense? The solution of how will the future relationship between the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, is known. Will it be that border, the other border, that part of Jerusalem, so many refugees? It's all known. If you want to solve it, you have on-the-shelf solution, ready-made solution. Why doesn't it happen? It doesn't happen because when the Palestinian friend comes to me and says, Avraham, you know, when you established your state of Israel, actually you demolished all the previous Palestinian history, hundreds of villages, memories, dates, locations, longing, you name it. It was a real tragedy. It was a real Nakba, says my Palestinian friends. And I tell him, this is a tragedy? Wait till you see mine. I had the Holocaust. So all of a sudden, we're not about politics. We're about psychopolitics, about the competition of traumas. Mine is bigger, yours bigger. Mine is bigger, mine is bigger. In this competition of traumas, there is a very interesting mechanism. In order to make mine bigger, I have to belittle yours. In order to belittle yours, I have to deny yours. So we are living in a reality that many people at the mainstream are denying the tragedy of the other side and therefore find it very difficult to develop any kind of empathy for the fears and traumas of the other side to build upon the empathy the whatever solution possible. Yet, the mainstream of both societies are about to say, your Holocaust, my Nakba, not my circus, not my monkey. But many people in both societies, Palestinian in Palestine and in Israel, and Jewish in Israel and in the diaspora, are saying, I would like to listen, to participate, to understand, to know better about the traumas of the other side. And I believe that out of this yet minority position of few, the strategy of the many will emerge.
Alavai, as my grandmother would have said.